Who have a really interesting description of censorship, of self censorship, also, as you've been talking about. Who's King Mustache? And this gap, I think, I hope you write even more than you've written in the book about these ideas because it's so strong. This censorship gaps that are created between the dormant thought pile and the kind of thing under the speech curve.
Yeah. So first of all, I like to think of, I think it's a useful tool is this thing called a thought pile, which is if you have on any given issue, you have a horizontal spectrum. And just say I could take your brain out of your head and I put it on the thought pile right where you happen to believe about that issue. Now I did that for everyone in the community or in a society. And you're going to end up with a big mushy pile that I think will often form a bell curve. If it's really politicized, it might form like a camel with two humps because it's like concentrated here. But for a typical issue, it'll just form, a fear of AI. You're going to have a bell curve, right? Things like this. That's the thought pile. Now, the second thing is a line that I call the speech curve, which is what people are saying. So the speech curve is high when not just a lot of people are saying it, but it's being said from the biggest platforms. It's being said in the, in the New York Times, and it's being said by the president on, in the State of the Union. Those things are the top of the speech curve. Now, and then when the speech curve is lower, it means it's being said either whispered in small groups or it's just not very many people are talking about it. Mm-hmm. Now, when a free speech democracy is healthy on a certain topic, you've got the speech curve sitting right on top of the thought pile. They mirror each other, which is naturally what would happen. More people think something, it's going to be said more often and from higher platforms. What censorship does, and censorship can be from the government. So I use the tale of King Mustache. And King Mustache, he's a little tiny tyrant, and he's very sensitive, and people are making fun of his mustache, and they're saying he's not a good king, and he does not like that. So what does he do? He enacts a policy, and he says, anyone who has heard criticizing me or my mustache or my rule will be put to death. And immediately at the town, because his father was a very liberal. It was always free speech in his kingdom. But now King Mustache has taken over and he's saying this is a new rules now. And so a few people yell out and they say, that's not how we do things here. And that moment is what I call a moment of truth. Did the king's guards stand with the principles of the kingdom and say, yeah, King Mustache, that's not what we do, in which case he would kind of have to, he's nothing he can do. Or are they going to execute? So in this case, it's as if he laid down an electric fence over a part of this thought pile and said, no one's allowed to speak over here. The speech curve, maybe people will think these things, but the speech curve cannot go over here. But the electric fence wasn't actually electrified until the king's guards, in a moment of truth, get scared and say, okay, and they hang the 5 people who spoke out. So in that moment, that fence just became electric. And now no one criticizes King Mustache anymore. So I use this as an allegory. Now, of course, he has a hard cudgel because he can execute people. Mm-hmm. But now when we look at the US, what you're seeing right now is a lot of pressure, which is very similar. An electric fence is being laid down saying no one can criticize these ideas. And if you do, you won't be executed, you'll be canceled. You'll be fired. Now, what is that fence electrified from there? No, they can't actually, they're not working the company, they can't fire you. But they can start a Twitter mob when someone violates that speech curve, when someone violates that speech rule, and then the leadership at the company has the moment of truth. And what the leaders should do is stand up for their company's values, which is almost always in favor of the employee, and say, look, even if they made a mistake, people make mistakes, we're not going to fire them. Or maybe that person actually said something that's reasonable and we should discuss it. But either way, we're not going to fire them. And if they said no, what happens is the Twitter mob actually they can't execute you. They go away. And the fence is proven to have no electricity. What's been the problem with the past few years is what's happened again and again is the leader gets scared and they get scared of the Twitter mob and they fire them. Boom, that fence has electricity. And now actually, if you cross that, it's not just, a threat. Like you'll be out of a job. Like it's really bad. Like you'll have a huge penalty. You might not be able to feed your kids. So that's an electric fence that goes up. Now, what happens when an electric fence goes up and it's proven to actually be electrified? The speech curve morphs into a totally different position. And now these new people say, instead of having the kind of marketplace of ideas, that turns into a kind of a natural bell curve, they say, no. These ideas are okay to say, and not just okay, you'll be socially rewarded. And these ones don't. That's the rules of their own echo chamber that they're now applying to everyone. And it's working. And so the speech curve distorts. And so you end up with now, instead of one region, which is a region of kind of active communal thinking, what people are thinking and saying, you now have 3 regions. You have a little active communal thinking, but mostly you now have this dormant thought pile, which is all these opinions that suddenly everyone's scared to say out loud.
Everyone's thinking, but they're scared to say it out
Everyone's
loud.
thinking, but no one's saying. And then you have this other region, which is the approved ideas of this now cultural kind of dictator. And those are being spoken from the largest platforms, and they're being repeated by the president, and they're being repeated all over the place, even though people don't believe it. And that's this distortion. And what happens is the society becomes really stupid, because active communal thinking is the region where we can actually think together. And now no one can think together. And it gets siloed into small private conversations.
It's really powerful what you said about institutions and so on. It's not trivial from a leadership position to be like, no, we defend the employee, or we defend the employee, the person with us on our, because there's no actual ground to any kind of violation we're hearing about. So the mob, they resist the mob. And it's ultimately to the leader, I guess, of a particular institution, of a particular company, and it's difficult.
No, it's not. If it were easy, it wouldn't. There wouldn't be all of these failings. And by the way, that's the immune system failing. Yeah. That's the liberal immune system of that company failing. But also, then it's an example, which means that a lot of other, it's failing to the country. It's not easy. Of course it's not, because we have primitive minds that are wired to care so much about what people think of us. And even if we're not going to, maybe, first of all, we're scared that it's going to start because there's, what do mobs do? They don't just say, I'm going to criticize you. I'm going to criticize anyone who still buys your product. Mm-hmm. I'm going to criticize anyone who goes on your podcast. Mm-hmm. So it's not just you. It's now suddenly, if Lex becomes tarnished enough, now I go on the podcast and people are saying, "Oh, I'm not buying his book. He went on Lex Fridman. No thanks." Right? And now I call it a smear web. Like, you've been smeared, and we're in such a bad time that smear travels to me. And now, meanwhile, someone who buys my book and tries to share it, someone says, "You're buying that guy's book." He goes on Lex Fridman. You see how this happens, right? So that hasn't happened in this case, so we are so wired. That is kind of bad, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that is actually bad for you, but we're wired to care about it so much because it meant life or death back in the day.
Yeah. And luckily in this case, we're both probably can smear each other in this conversation. Yes. This is wonderful.
I smear you all the time.
Given the nature of your book. What do you think about freedom of speech as a term and as an idea, as a way to resist this mechanism of dormant thought pile and artificially generated speech? This ideal of the freedom of speech and protecting speech and celebrating speech.
Yeah. Well, so this is kind of the point I was talking about earlier about King Mustache made a rule against he's created official.
I just love the one of the amazing things about your book, as you get later and later in the book, you cover more and more difficult issues as a way to illustrate the importance of the vertical perspective. But there's something about using hilarious drawings throughout that make it much more fun, and it takes you away from the personal somehow, and you start thinking in the space of ideas versus outside of the tribal type of thinking. So it's a really brilliant. I mean, I would advise for anybody to do when they write controversial books to have hilarious drawings.
It's true. Put a silly stick figure in your thing, and it lightens the mood. It gets people's guard down a little bit, and
it works.
It reminds people that we're all friends here, right? Yeah. We're let's laugh at ourselves, laugh at the fact that we're in a culture war a little bit, and now we can talk about it, right? As opposed to getting religious about it. But basically, King Mustache had no First Amendment. He said the government is censoring, right? Which is very common around the world, right? Governments censor all them. The U.S., again, you can argue there's some controversial things recently, but basically the U.S., the First Amendment isn't the problem, right? No one is being arrested for saying the wrong thing, but this graph is still happening. And so freedom of speech, when people, what people like to say is, if someone's complaining about cancel culture and saying, this is anti-free speech, people like to point out, no, it's not. The government's not arresting you for anything. This is called the free market, buddy. This is called, you're putting your ideas out and you're getting criticized, and your precious marketplace of ideas, there it is, right? And I've gotten this a lot. And this is not making a critical distinction between cancel culture and criticism culture. Criticism culture is a little bit of this kind of high rung idea lab stuff we talked about, criticism culture attacks the idea
Mhm.
and encourages further discussion, right? It enlivens discussion. It makes everyone smarter. Cancel culture attacks the person. Very different. Criticism culture says, here's why this idea is so bad. Let me tell you. Cancel culture says, here's why this person is bad and no one should talk to them and they should be fired. And what does that do? It doesn't enliven the discussion. It makes everyone scared to talk, and it's the opposite. It shuts down discussion. So you still have your First Amendment, but First Amendment plus cancel culture equals you might as well be in King Must. You might as well have government censorship, right? First Amendment plus criticism culture, great. Now you have this vibrant marketplace of ideas. So there's a very clear difference. And so when people criticize the cancel culture and then someone says, oh, see, you're so sensitive now, you're doing the cancel culture yourself. You're trying to punish this person for criticizing. No. Every good liberal, and I mean that in the lowercase, which is that anyone who believes in liberal democracies, regardless of what they believe, should stand up and say no to cancel culture and say this is not okay, regardless of what the actual topic is. And that makes them a good liberal versus if they're trying to cancel someone who's just criticizing, they're doing the opposite. Now they're shutting. So it's the opposite things, but it's very easy to get confused. You can see people take advantage of and sometimes they just don't know it themselves. The lines here can be very confusing. The wording can be very confusing, and without that wording, suddenly it looks like someone who's criticizing cancel culture is canceling, but they're not.